Chandra Ann Levy was born on April 14, 1977 in Cleveland, Ohio, but her story would travel far beyond those early beginnings. When she was still young, her family moved across the country to Modesto, California, a place where she grew up surrounded by hope, ambition, and a clear sense that she was meant for something bigger. Her parents, Robert and Susan Levy, described her as bright, determined, and relentless when she believed in something. She wasn't just smart. She was driven, someone who constantly pushed herself toward a future she was already imagining. In Modesto, Chandra flourished. She attended local schools, excelled academically, and developed a reputation for being mature beyond her years. Friends recalled that she wasn't content with average. She wanted movement, challenge, purpose. That hunger for achievement led her to San Francisco State University, where she earned a degree in journalism. That alone could have been the start of a strong career, but Chandra didn't stop. She pushed even further. She went on to pursue a master's degree at the University of Southern California, one of the nation's most prestigious programs. USC recognized her potential and accepted her into its public administration master's program, an achievement that already set her on a path toward federal government service. She loved politics. She loved the energy of national conversations. She loved the idea of shaping policy, even in small ways, and believed that government work mattered. Her professors described her as talented, sociable, curious, and deeply focused on a future in public service. And that ambition is exactly what took her to Washington, D.C. In October 2000, Chandra secured an internship at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, assigned to the Public Affairs Division. For a 24-year-old graduate student, this was the opportunity of a lifetime, a direct door into the world she hoped to enter. She arrived in the nation's capital ready to soak up everything: the culture, the politics, the atmosphere of power. Washington, D.C. can be intimidating for many people, but for Chandra, it was the place where her adulthood clicked into full motion. She was young, she was talented, and she was discovering her independence. Friends recalled her excitement when she talked about the city, walking past government buildings, attending events, and feeling like she was right in the center of something important. Chandra knew this was where she wanted her career to grow. By the spring of 2001, she was nearing the end of her internship, planning to return home to Modesto for her graduation. Just days before she vanished, she had already been making arrangements, wrapping up duties, preparing to leave her Washington life behind for a brief moment of celebration with her family. She had earned it. But there was another side to her D.C. life, a side almost no one knew. Chandra was not just an intern in the capital. She was a young woman navigating a city full of secrets, ambition, and political power. And at just 24 years old, she found herself in spaces where most people her age would never be invited. Her disappearance would later expose how deeply connected she had become to Washington's political world. A detail that would turn her case from a missing person investigation into one of the most explosive national stories of the decade. Chandra was adventurous, thoughtful, and full of life. She jogged in Rock Creek Park. She explored the city. She kept detailed plans about her future. She believed she was only at the beginning of a long and meaningful journey. And that's what makes her disappearance so haunting. She was right on the edge of starting her real life when everything suddenly stopped. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that understanding who Chandra Levy was, the decisions she made, the world she lived in, and the people she knew, would become the key to understanding the mystery that swallowed her. If you're new here on Real Crime Documentary Stories, hit subscribe now so you don't miss any of our incoming true crime stories. May 1st, 2001. A date that should have been ordinary. A quiet spring morning in Washington, D.C., the kind of day where people jog through Rock Creek Park, rush into metro stations, or sit in coffee shops with laptops open. For 24-year-old Chandra Levy, this day would become the last time anyone saw her alive. That morning, Chandra was inside her Dupont Circle apartment. She wasn't packing for a flight, she wasn't rushing to work, she wasn't running errands. She was logged into her laptop, browsing websites that, in hindsight, would become the most chilling clues in her disappearance. At 11:33 a.m., she looked up information related to Rock Creek Park. A minute later, she clicked on a map of the park. Earlier in her searches that day, she had viewed sites related to Amtrak schedules, Busconrubben's locations, and Southwest Airlines flights. These searches seemed unrelated at the time, but investigators later realized that Rock Creek Park was the final clue pointing toward where she may have gone. And then silence. From that point forward, no friend spoke to her, no family member heard from her, no credit card activity, no phone records, nothing. It was as if she slipped out of Washington and vanished into thin air. By May 6th, 5 days later, her parents Robert and Susan Levy grew increasingly terrified. Their daughter never went this long without contact. They called her phone repeatedly. They checked with relatives, friends, colleagues, anyone who might have heard from her. The silence only grew louder, and that's when they made the call every parent dreads. They reported Chandra missing. The Metropolitan Police Department moved swiftly at first. Officers arrived at her Dupont Circle apartment, expecting to find signs of travel or a quick departure. Instead, what they found made the situation even more disturbing. Her luggage was partially packed, as if she had started preparing for something but never finished. Her travel documents, ID, and credit cards were all left inside the apartment. Nothing indicated she planned to leave D.C. on her own. Nothing even suggested she planned to step more than a few blocks outside her building. Her cell phone wasn't taken with her. Her keys were still inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken lock, no struggle. Everything was frozen in time. When police examined her computer, the browser history narrowed the possible timeline. Rock Creek Park, one of Washington, D.C.'s most secluded, dense, and unpredictable natural areas, was the last location she looked up before disappearing, and she looked it up just minutes before going silent forever. But even with that information, something went wrong, something that would later haunt investigators and frustrate the entire nation. The specific slope and wooded area of Rock Creek Park where her remains would eventually be found was never searched in the initial sweep. Despite being within the police's designated search parameters, miscommunication between teams allowed that steep, heavily wooded hillside to remain untouched. That mistake would cost investigators an entire year. As days turned into weeks, the mystery deepened. Media attention exploded. This was not just any missing woman. This was Chandra Levy, a young, ambitious intern working in Washington's government sphere. Her disappearance struck a nerve. Headlines flashed across the country. Reporters packed into press briefings. Speculation ran wild, especially when whispers surfaced about her connection to Congressman Gary Condit. Suddenly, her story wasn't just a missing person case, it was a national scandal. Back in Modesto, California, her parents were living inside a nightmare. Robert and Susan Levy began giving interviews, pleading for help. They begged for answers. They begged for action. They begged for someone, anyone, to tell them what happened to their daughter. Every morning felt like a repeat of the last, waiting for updates, hopping for news, fearing the worst. Her mother described waking up each day with a sinking feeling, a dread that Chandra wasn't coming home. Her father described the frustration of dealing with police missteps, the agonizing slow pace of communication, the helplessness that comes when your child is missing hundreds of miles away. Inside Washington, D.C., the tension grew. Public pressure pushed investigators harder. The case became one of the most high-profile disappearances in modern U.S. history, dominating airtime and fueling public debates about safety, power, and the complicated world Chandra had been navigating. The longer she remained missing, the more theories surfaced. Was she taken? Did she leave on her own? Was someone she knew involved? The questions multiplied, but answers remained hidden deep within Rock Creek Park, waiting to be discovered. Chandra Levy walked out of her Dupont Circle apartment on May 1, 2001. But no one knows exactly where she went or why. All that remained were clues on her laptop, an unfinished suitcase, and a family drowning in fear. If you're finding this story compelling, like this video and leave a comment below with your thoughts on how the investigation was handled. As investigators struggled to piece together the final hours of Chandra Levy's life, another revelation surfaced, one that would change the direction of the investigation, ignite a political firestorm, and turn a missing person case into one of the most sensationalized news stories of the early 2000s. Behind the polished image of a successful graduate student and federal intern, Chandra had been keeping a secret affair with someone powerful, a man who held influence, connections, and authority in Washington, D.C. Gary Condit, a married U.S. congressman representing California's 18th district. When Chandra disappeared, this detail wasn't known publicly. Only a small circle of people were aware. But once investigators discovered the relationship, everything shifted. Gary Condit at first denied any romantic involvement. He admitted to knowing Chandra, but insisted the relationship was simply friendly, part of typical constituent interactions. But investigators weren't convinced. Phone records and testimony from people close to Chandra suggested there was more: late-night conversations, secret meetings, emotional closeness. Soon, friends of Chandra came forward, confirming that she had confided in them about a romantic relationship with the congressman. Police questioned Condit multiple times. His behavior during those interviews drew scrutiny. Critics claimed he was evasive. Others believed he was protecting his political career. Whether he was guilty of any crime or simply guilty of an affair, the damage was immediate. The news leaked. And within hours, the story of a missing intern transformed into a national scandal involving a high-ranking congressman. The media pounced. Cable news stations ran breaking alerts. Tabloids plastered his face across front pages. Headlines screamed about an affair, a disappearance, secrets, betrayal, and the dark underbelly of Washington, D.C. political life. What began as the tragedy of a missing 24-year-old woman spiraled into a political circus. Suddenly, every detail about Chandra Levy's personal life became public property. The public wasn't just asking what happened to her. They were asking who she loved, who she trusted, and who might have wanted to hide those connections. The focus shifted from evidence to scandal, from missing person leads to political commentary, from searching Rock Creek Park to analyzing Gary Condit's facial expressions on television. The investigation suffered under the weight of this spectacle. Instead of police resources being directed toward ground searches, tip follow-ups, and forensic analysis, a major portion of their efforts became centered on Condit, interviewing him again, verifying timelines, responding to the media storm that his involvement ignited. And while investigators insisted they were following the evidence, the public had already decided. A young intern, a powerful congressman, a secret affair, a sudden disappearance. It was too dramatic, too cinematic, too provocative for people not to assume the worst. The frenzy drowned out other leads, some that might have mattered. The media spotlight was so intense that potential witnesses hesitated to come forward, afraid they too would be dragged into the tabloid hurricane. Every move the Levy family made was scrutinized. Every statement from the police was dissected. Every update, no matter how small, was turned into a headline. In the process, Chandra herself, the victim, became overshadowed. Her dreams, her goals, her promising future, her humanity. The conversation shifted almost entirely to political implications. Commentators debated whether Condit's career was over. Analysts speculated about cover-ups, power plays, and secret motives. And all the while, the most important question, what happened to Chandra Levy, was lost beneath layers of speculation. Gary Condit's political career crumbled under the pressure. By 2002, he lost his re-election bid. His reputation was destroyed, not because he was charged with any crime, but because the public had tied his name irrevocably to Chandra's disappearance. In the court of public opinion, guilt and association often look the same. This was the power of the media. This was the danger of a narrative that spiraled out of control. The story became bigger than the facts, bigger than the investigation, bigger than the victim. And this media storm would leave investigators scrambling as the case grew colder, leads dried up, and the truth remained buried in the wooded silence of Rock Creek Park. Don't forget to subscribe now if you want more deep dives like this. And comment, do you think the media attention helped or hindered the investigation? For nearly a year, the disappearance of Chandra Levy remained a haunting mystery, one that gripped Washington, D.C., frustrated investigators, and devastated her family. But on May 22, 2002, everything changed. A man walking his dog through Rock Creek Park near Broad Branch Creek wandered off the paved trail, moving into the deeper, more isolated woods. His dog tugged toward a steep hillside, a quiet, concealed slope, thick with brush and fallen branches. And in that moment, the silence of Rock Creek Park broke. Scattered through the leaves and dirt, the man saw something pale, something that humanity recognizes instantly. Bones. He alerted the authorities. Police arrived, sectioned off the area, and began uncovering what the park had hidden for 12 months. The remains were skeletal, scattered, weathered by rain, wind, and time, but the location, less than a mile from where Chandra had looked on her computer on the morning of May 1, 2001, was unmistakably significant. Soon, dental records confirmed what investigators and the entire nation feared. The remains belonged to 24-year-old Chandra Ann Levy. It was the discovery her family dreaded, and one that would expose how badly the initial search had been handled. The very slope where her remains were found had been within the original MPD search perimeter, but due to miscommunication and poor coordination, that steep, wooded hillside was never searched thoroughly. A year of answers lost because of a simple, devastating oversight. Next to the remains, detectives found clothing. A sports bra, a sweatshirt, leggings, and tennis shoes. All scattered, all exposed to the elements, all in a state that made collecting definitive forensic evidence nearly impossible. Animals had disturbed the area, weather had eroded clues, time itself had become an enemy. On May 28, 2002, the D.C. medical examiner officially ruled the death a homicide. Though decomposition limited conclusions, there was a critical detail: damage to the hyoid bone, a small bone in the throat that can break during strangulation. It wasn't conclusive, but it strongly suggested the possibility that Chandra had been strangled. Still, crucial evidence was missing. There was no weapon, no phone, no purse, no defensive wounds they could confirm, no DNA conclusively tying anyone to the scene. It was a crime scene frozen in time but blurred by nature. Investigators had to rebuild everything from nearly nothing. As detectives revisited their suspect list, one name climbed quickly to the top: Ngma Gwandukwa. Gwandukwa, an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador, was already in federal prison for violent attacks on 2 female joggers in Rock Creek Park, attacks committed in the same year Chandra disappeared, and in the same park where her remains were found. He had a pattern: target women, approach them in secluded areas, attack without warning, disappear into the woods. Several key details aligned with Chandra's case. He operated in Rock Creek Park. He attacked women who were alone. He used the terrain to hide quickly. His assaults happened close to the area where Chandra's remains were discovered. Investigators believed it was more than a coincidence. By 2009, After years of pressure from the Levy family and ongoing media coverage, prosecutors indicted Gwandukwa on multiple charges, including kidnapping, first-degree murder, attempted sexual assault, felony murder during a kidnapping. Prosecutors argued that Gwandukwa had likely encountered Chandra while she was jogging or hiking in Rock Creek Park, confronted her, and killed her during the attack. They presented him as a predator who used the vast, isolated trails of the park as hunting grounds. But even with this indictment, the investigation had gaps that could never be filled. Crucial evidence had vanished into the forest floor. The original search failures meant investigators were reconstructing events without fresh forensic data. And the only real link tying Gwandukwa to the case was circumstantial. His presence in the area, his history of violence against women in that same park, and statements he allegedly made to prison inmates. Still, with no other suspect fitting the evidence as closely as Gwandukwa, prosecutors moved forward. The discovery of Chandra Levy's remains finally provided closure to one part of the mystery, but it opened up an entirely new chapter, one filled with controversy, legal battles, public doubt, and a justice system struggling to make sense of what happened deep inside Rock Creek Park. Her remains answered the question of where Chandra Levy ended up. But they did nothing to answer how she got there, or why she never made it home on May 1, 2001. By the fall of 2010, more than 9 years had passed since Chandra Levy vanished from Washington, D.C. 9 years of unanswered questions. 9 years of media coverage, political fallout, and a grieving family trapped in limbo. But then justice seemed within reach. Gwandukwa, the undocumented immigrant from El Salvador already serving time for attacking 2 women in the same park where Chandra Levy's remains were found, was now standing trial for her murder. The prosecution's case was clear in its motive, even if the physical evidence was thin. They argued that on May 1, 2001, Chandra Levy had gone for a walk or jog in Rock Creek Park after searching the area on her laptop. And while alone on that trail, she crossed paths with Gwandukwa, who had already been preying on women in the park that spring. The prosecution leaned heavily on the testimony of a jailhouse informant named Amanda Morales, a former gang member who claimed that Gwandukwa confessed to killing Chandra during a late-night conversation behind bars. That testimony became the core of the government's case. Despite the lack of DNA evidence, despite no eyewitnesses to the crime, despite the fact that Gwandukwa had never confessed to police or in any recorded setting. In November 2010, the jury returned a verdict, guilty. Gwandukwa was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Chandra Levy. In February 2011, he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. For a brief moment, the Levy family finally had what they had waited for: justice. The headlines read, "Conviction secured, the case is closed." But the story wasn't over. Because behind the scenes, the case was already starting to crack. By 2013, Gwandukwa's legal team had begun raising concerns about the star witness, Amanda Morales. They claimed his testimony was unreliable, and worse, that prosecutors had failed to disclose key information about Morales's background. Their claim: Morales had a long history of manipulating the system to gain leniency. He had previously served as a government witness in other cases and had a pattern of using jailhouse confessions to benefit himself. Most damning of all, there were documents suggesting Morales had never even met Gwanduk in prison. Prosecutors were accused of failing to turn over those documents to the defense, violating what's known in law as the Brady Rule, a requirement that the prosecution disclose any evidence that might be favorable to the defense. The foundation of the case, the jailhouse confession, was suddenly in question. In 2015, prosecutors dropped their opposition to a new trial. They admitted that serious questions had emerged about Morales's credibility and acknowledged the integrity of the original trial was no longer intact. And in July 2016, everything unraveled. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. announced that they would not proceed with a new trial. Instead, they filed a motion to dismiss all charges against Ingmar Guandique. Not because they had proven him innocent, but because their case could no longer meet the standard for conviction. Guandique was turned over to federal immigration officials for deportation proceedings. And just like that, the case against him collapsed. No appeals, no retrial, no replacement suspect. Nearly 15 years after Chandra Levy disappeared, the man once convicted of her murder was released from criminal responsibility. And the Levy family, after years of emotional exhaustion, was left standing in the same position they had been in the spring of 2001, without answers. Legally, no one has ever been held accountable for the death of Chandra Levy. The implications are staggering. For the justice system, it exposed the fragility of convictions built on jailhouse informants, an issue that has plagued countless other cases nationwide. The trial that once brought resolution now stood as a warning. If you build your case on shaky ground, everything will collapse. For prosecutors, it was a moment of public embarrassment. The U.S. Attorney's Office had celebrated the 2010 conviction. 5 years later, they had to admit it wasn't strong enough to stand. For Chandra's family, it was a second trauma. After enduring years of pain, false hopes, and media scrutiny, they had to watch the case dissolve into uncertainty once again. Her mother, Susan Levy, told reporters, "I want the truth to come out. I want someone to be accountable." But the truth, even now, remains out of reach. And for the public, those who followed the case for years, it became a haunting reminder of how justice can be delayed, distorted, and even denied. Chandra Levy's name had once been at the center of a national scandal, but in the end, her death became a case study in the limits of American justice. We had a conviction. We had a sentence. We thought we had answers. But today, no one has been held responsible for the murder of Chandra Levy. And the truth about what really happened in Rock Creek Park on May 1, 2001, is still buried somewhere out there. More than 2 decades have passed since Chandra Levy walked out of her Dupont Circle apartment on the morning of May 1, 2001. And still, her case remains unsolved. Her disappearance, her death, and the investigation that followed became one of the most debated cold cases in modern American history. But time did not bring clarity. It brought more questions, more contradictions, and a deeper understanding of how fragile truth can be when lost in politics, media storms, and investigative errors. For the Levy family, the aftermath has been a long, painful journey. Her parents, Robert and Susan Levy, spent years in the public eye pleading for answers, confronting politicians, pressuring authorities, and fighting to keep their daughter's case from disappearing into silence. They watched investigators announce suspects, make arrests, deliver a conviction, celebrate justice, only to watch that justice unravel. They've spoken openly about the trauma of feeling misled, ignored, and left in the dark. To this day, they continue to remember Chandra not as a headline, but as their daughter, a young woman who loved running, learning, exploring, and striving for something bigger. They remember her as someone full of energy, intelligence, and ambition. Someone who was excited about her future, not destined to be defined by tragedy. For the public, Chandra Levy's name became a symbol, first of a scandal tied to power, then of investigative failure, and finally of a cold case that showed how deeply flawed the system can be when pressure, politics, and media frenzy collide. Her story reshaped the national conversation. It exposed the vulnerability of young interns in Washington, D.C. Bright students far from home, navigating a world of powerful men, hidden relationships, and unspoken risks. It revealed how easily the narrative of a case can shift when the media prioritizes spectacle over truth. And it showed the limitations of the justice system, where a lack of physical evidence, a botched early search, and unreliable witnesses can derail an entire investigation. So the questions remain, heavy, unanswered, and unsettling. How did Chandra end up in that remote slope of Rock Creek Park? Did she walk there on her own? Was she approached? Was she followed? Was it a targeted attack or a tragic coincidence? Why wasn't the search done correctly in 2001? Why was the exact location where she was eventually found left unsearched, despite being inside the official search perimeter? How many clues were lost because of those early mistakes? Were there other suspects? Did investigators focus too heavily on Gary Condit because of the media pressure? Did the spotlight on him blind authorities to other leads during the critical early days that might have changed everything? And the biggest question of all, will this case ever be solved? Every year that passes makes the answers feel further away. Evidence fades, witnesses scatter, memories blur, but cold cases don't die, they wait. Sometimes for decades, sometimes for a single new clue, sometimes for one person to finally come forward. What remains today is a legacy, one part tragedy, one part cautionary tale. The case of Chandra Levy forced the U.S. to confront uncomfortable truths. That media attention can distort investigations. That pressure can push law enforcement toward shortcuts. That young women, especially those pursuing careers in powerful cities like Washington, D.C., are often more vulnerable than anyone realizes. And that even high-profile cases can fall apart when the system fails. But beyond the headlines, beyond the political scandal and courtroom drama, there is the human side. A life lost. A promising future stolen. A young woman who traveled to Washington, D.C. full of hope, only to become the center of one of the most heartbreaking mysteries of the 21st century. Chandra Levy was more than a case file. She was a daughter, a friend, a student, a dreamer. Her story deserves justice. Her name deserves remembrance. And her family deserves answers. As long as her case remains unsolved, her story remains unfinished. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Please hit the like button, comment below, and make sure you're subscribed to Real Crime Documentary Stories so you don't miss our next deep dive. Share this video to keep Chandra Levy's memory alive and to call for justice. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant.